Hello, everyone. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, my name is Elizabeth Perez, and I am the program associate here with the COC team at All Chicago. So I will be talking to you today about the Housing Inventory Count Survey. And I also have with me Amanda Borda, but she will be handling the questions that get submitted. So hopefully you'll be able to hear her a little bit. So before we begin, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. All of the lines have been muted. This is for easy listening. During the presentation, if you have any questions, you can feel free to enter them into the chat box. If time allows, I will open up the lines for you to ask your questions directly. But since we do have quite a couple of slides to get through today, I do want to get through the entire presentation. And then, like I mentioned, if time allows, I'll open those up. If we do have enough time for that, please raise your hand, and if you are connected via the computer, please make sure that your mic is working so that way we are able to hear you. If you do not have a mic working through your computer, you can feel free to use the call-in option. So that way you can use the phone to make your question, and that way we're able to hear you. All right, so before we dive in, let's take a look at today's learning objectives. So after today's webinar, I really want everyone to have an understanding of the housing inventory count, the purpose, and the process. You should be able to complete a HIC survey for each of your programs at your agency. And I've also included some information on upcoming trainings for the point-in-time count. And I'll also be reviewing kind of each of those terms for anyone that's new and this is their first time doing the housing inventory count and point-in-time count. You'll be able to know what those terms mean. Now this is our agenda for today. As you can see, we have quite a couple of items. We'll be reviewing common terms. We'll also be reviewing the HIC history, the HIC purpose, and the HIC process. I'll be discussing what's new in the 2016 HIC, and then really dive into the actual HIC survey sections. I'll be reviewing some of the common mistakes that we saw in 2015, so hopefully in 2016 we won't have that many of those. And we'll be discussing the deadlines along with any helpful tips that you can use, and along with resources and upcoming trainings. So let's go ahead and get started. So before we start talking about everything, as you may know and as you may have heard, we do use a lot of acronyms. So you'll be able to hear me kind of go back and forth with the HIC and the housing inventory count, but that's the same thing. We just like abbreviations. And I'll be discussing more in the next slide what the HIC means. The point in time, which we also refer to it as the PIT, is the actual count of people experiencing homelessness on a given night. So for the sake of this webinar, we won't be discussing a lot about the PIT, but I do want you to know that the HIC and the PIT are closely integrated. So we do take that data from the PIT and also include it in the HIC. So we do want everything to match up. But just because you participated in the HIC doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to participate in the PIT, or vice versa. So I do want everyone to know that. And if you have any questions about that, you can feel free to ask. For the housing inventory count, we'll be talking a lot about beds and units. For beds, throughout the HIC survey, you'll be hearing a lot about bed numbers. And when we talk about beds, we define those as a piece of furniture for sleep, typically a framework with a mattress. We would also consider a cot as a bed. For the HIC, A crib, unfortunately, does not count as a bed, and you'll be able to count those separately. So we do want to be able to count those infants that you see in your programs. For a unit, we consider those anything a unit that is intended as a separate living quarter. Now, for the different programs, that can vary. This can be a single room, or it can be an apartment. And once we get to that section, I'll be able to describe that a little bit more. So hopefully everyone can walk away with an understanding of what we mean by a unit. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, we'll refer to them as HUD. We'll be talking a little bit more on kind of what their role is for the HIC and the PIT. The Homeless Data Exchange is the system where we enter all the HIC and the PIT data. So you don't need to worry about, an access or username for this database. This is something that DFSS and us at All Chicago look at a little bit more thoroughly. But we do want to let you know what that is, because if you're signed up for the notifications from HUD, you'll probably see a couple of emails regarding HDX. So I do want you to know that that is something that you shouldn't worry about, and you shouldn't be concerned with creating a username and password. For a lot of you, you may know about the Chicago Program Model Chart. And for those of you who don't, I would highly encourage you to review the Chicago Program Models Chart. It does give highlights of what each of the program models that we will be discussing today, kind of what it means to be a safe haven, what it means to be a permanent supportive housing, and so forth. One thing that is relatively new is that it was revised in December of 2014. So if you haven't had a chance to go in there and review it, I do highly encourage you to do that. And finally, the COC, which refers to the continuum of care. That is pretty much everyone that is a stakeholder that touches the homeless system. So that could be service providers, funders, people experiencing homelessness. So that's what we talk about when we reference the COC. So let's get started. So what is the housing inventory count? So each year, the HUD requires each COC to count its housing inventory on the same night as the annual point-in-time count. This year, the counts will take place on the night of January 26th, which will be a Tuesday. And when we discuss and when we say housing inventory, we are referring to all the projects that have beds and units that are dedicated to serving people experiencing homelessness, regardless of the funding source. So if you're receiving private funding to operate your program, we also want to be able to count your program in the housing inventory. So this goes for ESG, COC funding, everyone, because we're all committed to the same goal, and that's ending homelessness in the city of Chicago. So just to give you some background on the history of the housing inventory count and why we do it. So one of the main reasons is that it is a HUD requirement. So for a lot of our HUD-funded agencies, this is something that is included in your contract, so you do have to participate. However, All Chicago and the city DFSS sees the value of this information, and we do analyze it in order to view kind of what our inventory is, and we can make data-informed decisions as to funding sources once there is some new funding, if there is a need for transitional housing or for permanent supportive housing. We're able to make that decisions based on what we have in Chicago. The housing inventory count is done annually. So if you ever have a question kind of where that information is, that is available on our website. And it is always done in the last 10 days in January. The reason why it's done in the last 10 days in January is that it is held in conjunction with the point in time count. As you know, the last weeks in January tend to be the coldest. So that is one of the main reasons that we aim for those dates, because it will encourage anyone that is experiencing homelessness to access our programs. Now, the purpose of the HIC is that it contributes to the annual homeless assessment report, which is also known as AHARD. This is a report that goes to Congress that provides nationwide estimates of homelessness. This includes information about the demographic characteristics of homeless people, service patterns, and the capacity to house people experiencing homelessness. It also contributes to the COC application. So for many of you, you do know about the Notice of Funding Availability, which establishes the funding criteria for the COC programs. Every COC nationwide must complete 2 sections, which is the project applications and the COC application. And in the COC application is where we really see information related to the housing inventory. So I just wanted to give you just a very brief overview about what the 2016 process for the HIC looks like. So every year we do receive guidance from HUD regarding what questions to ask for in the HIC and the PIT. So these questions we really don't just kind of create on our own. We do have some guidance from HUD about that. Once we have that guidance, we'll be able to create the survey, and in turn, just like how are we doing today, we will be doing trainings for all of our agencies to make sure that you understand what we mean by the questions, so that way once the HIC is submitted, hopefully you'll be able to know what we mean. You'll be able to submit a HIC for each of your programs that operate, that meet the qualifications to submit a HIC. And then once that is done, usually in February, I'll be doing follow-ups. So what I mean by follow-ups is that usually I reach out to individuals where the information, there might be a little bit of a discrepancy, or your numbers have changed drastically from 2015 to 2016. Since those, usually we can have a conversation about how those numbers have changed. Maybe you've increased in funding or maybe lost some funding. So I want to be able to talk with you to know a little bit more about kind of what's happening or what happened between 2015 to 2016. And finally, in April is when we submit all of this data into the HDX database. So what's new for 2016? So today's webinar will be recorded. So if, let's say you have some questions later on, or maybe you had a colleague who unfortunately wasn't able to attend, you can always refer back to the webinar to kind of review it or share it with fellow colleagues. Based on some feedback that we got from 2015, we went ahead and elaborated on the definitions, which is why you'll see a major emphasis on what we mean by beds and what we mean by units. That will be available kind of in a one-page document. So even though it's embedded into the HIC survey, let's say you just kind of want to review what we mean by all those terms, you'll have that one page to refer to. New in 2016, we'll also be having a lot of pre-populated answers into the HIC survey. So for many, sometimes the staff person that submitted the HIC in 2015 is no longer there, or a lot of things have happened in a year and you may not quite remember the specifics about what was submitted in 2015. and trying to find where that document is. So to make things a little bit easier for everyone, we went ahead and pre-populated those answers into the HICS survey. And you'll be asked to either confirm or update those numbers or any of those questions. For our rapid rehousing and SSVF providers, we will be having a specialized webinar just for you because you do complete the HICS survey a little bit differently than the other projects. We will touch briefly on kind of what those areas are in today's webinar, but we want to be able to thoroughly explain it to those programs in a separate webinar. And finally, we'll be having a frequently asked questions document. So for all the questions that we received today, if we unfortunately run out of time and aren't able to get to all the questions, we'll be submitting those here. Also, if you have any questions from now until when the HIC is due, you can feel free to email us at the cocprograms@allchicago.org with a list of those questions, and we'll be more than glad to assist you with those, and those will also be included in the FAQs. We want this document to have a series of questions because I know everyone has them, and that way you can easily refer back to that document to see if anyone has that same question as you do. So before we get started into what the actual HICS survey looks like, let's determine who needs to submit one. So any project that has a bed or unit that is dedicated to serving homeless persons or families, you have to submit a HICS survey. So what we mean by this is that you, and I'll be using the term project and program interchangeably, so just so you know. The project must verify the homeless status as part of its eligibility determination. And also, the actual project clients are predominantly homeless. So those are two of the main things that you have to look for in determining whether your program has to submit a HIC. Now, for permanent supportive housing, I know many of your clients lose the homeless status at entry once they enter into your program, but you still have to complete a HIC survey because at the point of entry, they were considered homeless. Now let's talk about how many HIC surveys you have to do and when they're due. Regarding how many, it really depends on how many projects fit that description at your agency. So I know for a lot of agencies, you may be operating maybe 3 programs that would fit that description. So 3 separate HIC surveys must be submitted. However, there are other agencies that maybe just have 1, so you would just have to submit 1 HIC survey, okay? All HIC surveys must be submitted no later than 5 p.m. on Thursday, January 28th. All the HIC surveys will be submitted via SurveyGizmo, which will go into further detail later on in the presentation. So before we jump into the HIC survey sections, Amanda, I'm not sure if there's any questions that we need to ask that would be helpful for everyone.
No, not at this time, but could you just clarify that it will be due on the 28th, but it's based on data from what day?
Yes, great, thank you. So yes, even though it is due on January 28th, your data will reflect data from Tuesday, January 26th. So that is the day that the point in time count will be happening as well. So we'll be asking a lot of questions related to information from Tuesday, January 26th. However, we didn't want to make everyone rush and do the HIC survey that same day, in conjunction with the point in time count documents. So we're giving you, a couple days after to submit your HIC survey. Okay. So these are the sections for the 2016 HIC survey. So there are 8 sections, which I know I sent out the HIC survey in a PDF form. And if you open that document up and you're kind of looking at all the questions, you may get a little bit scared as to the number of questions. However, as we're going through that, I hope I can kind of ease those fears of being at a very long survey, because we've tried really hard this year to make it a very simplified HIC survey. And as I mentioned earlier, since a lot of this information pre-populated from 2015, if you didn't have any change from 2015 to 2016, a lot of those questions will not show up for you. So hopefully it'll be a very simplified HIC survey, very easy to input that information and just kind of breeze through it. Okay. So the first section is your project information. That would be your agency name, your primary contact, so that would be the, the person's full name. And with primary contact, I really want someone who would be able to talk to me if I have any questions about the HIC. So I know sometimes that primary contact information is for someone who didn't complete the HIC survey. So if you can really just focus on who that person, the most adequate person to be the primary contact would be in case there are any questions, please go ahead and fill their full name, their title, and their email address. New this year, we also included a secondary contact. So this is anyone who you feel, would be helpful in maybe getting information about when the HIC is due, when that information, is ready for release and things of that nature. I know since the HIC we tend to talk about it only one time a year, really. Sometimes at our agencies, there is a lot of turnover. So just having one contact person, and if they leave throughout the year, kind of leaves the agency with no information about the HIC until I'm able to update that. So for moving forward in future years, we want to be able to have at least 2 people that will be receiving information regarding the HIC. We'll also be asking about the site address. For those scattered sites, we'll be asking for the zip code. So if you just operate in a certain zip code, you can just go ahead and enter that one. Or if you have multiple, we want to know what zip codes your program is in. And finally, the funding sources. So the funding source list is a little bit more extensive than it was in the previous years. So we want you to be able to look at those different sources and be able to identify what the funding source is for your program. So in that first section, you'll be seeing this this question. So this is a snapshot of exactly what it looks like in the HIC survey. As I mentioned, we do have a lot of questions that pre-populate with information from 2015. So in order for you to be able to access that information, you will have to enter a username and password. Now, your username will be the project name, and the password will be the HMIS ID number associated with that project. Now, I know for a lot of you, maybe you don't have that information readily available, or I know sometimes, we tend to abbreviate our program's names, so we may not really readily remember what we included it as last year. One thing I do want to note that this function tends to work best if you just copy directly from the 2015 HIC submission chart and paste that username right into the box. Now, instead of having everyone go back into their files and find the 2015 HIC survey that you submitted, we went ahead and created a document that has all that information. And you'll see that here on your screen. So this is what it'll look like. In the HIC survey, there is a hyperlink that'll take you to this chart. And as I mentioned, that you'll be able to use the username will be the project name. And as you can see on your screen, that's highlighted in blue. So you'll be able to copy that information and just paste it directly into that username box. And then your password is going to be that HMIS ID number, which is located to the left-hand side in orange. And you'll just be able to enter that number, and that hopefully will take you through. Now, if this option does not work for you and you're trying to type that information in, I do want to make you aware that this username and password is case sensitive. So even if you are copying directly, trying to type it in, for example, a Safe Haven South, you will have to make sure that the A, the S, the H, and the S are all capital letters. If you're having any difficulty with this step, feel free to reach out to us so that way we can troubleshoot. But I would highly recommend for everyone to use the copy and paste option. I found that worked best for me, and it also was a whole lot easier than trying to type everything out. The next section is regarding your project type. So your 2015 information regarding your Chicago program model type, your HUD type, and for emergency shelters only, the bed type will show up. Now, if you are not an emergency shelter, you'll see an NA in that column, so don't worry about that. I just say emergency shelters, just make sure that you verify that information. So once you entered your login information, once you hit next on the survey, all that information will pre-populate as it is shown on your screen. So as you can see, there'll be a 2015 on the far left-hand side, and right underneath it'll state your Chicago program model type, your HUD type, and your bed type. And then it'll ask you if all of these are correct for your project. Now, based on your answer, if everything is correct, you will jump to the next section. However, if there are some changes, let's say your program went from an emergency shelter to a transitional housing project in 2015, maybe toward the end of the year. So you're going to have to update that information for us. And this is what it looks like. And you'll see that the question that pops up once you say no, that this question is not correct, you'll see that it'll say you indicated the Chicago program model type was incorrect. Now, this is just an example. So since the Chicago program models chart was revised in December of 2014, we highly encourage you to review that chart just to make sure that you are in alignment with the Chicago program models chart. Once you have reviewed it, you will feel free to select which of the models is most appropriate for your program. And for those of you who have not had a chance to review the Chicago program models chart, here is a snapshot of what it looks like. So as you can see, the models chart does include core values for Chicago's homeless service continuum. And then it'll go and break down into each of the different model types. So you'll have permanent housing, homeless prevention, interim housing, and so forth. So I highly encourage you to review that just to make sure that you're hitting all those core elements, and of course that you are identifying under the correct model type. Now, regarding your HUD type, I know I get a lot of questions about this because a lot of you do not receive HUD funding, so you don't know what HUD type you're considered. So we try to provide a definition for each of those types once you indicated that it is incorrect. So you'll have the option of reviewing whether your program would qualify under a transitional housing, as an emergency shelter, as a permanent housing, and so forth. So I encourage you to review those definitions and see which one of those best defines your program. Okay. Section 3 will be the target population. So again, this is another section that will pre-populate with information from 2015. As shown on your screen, you'll be able to see what your target population is and what subpopulation you selected in 2015. Now, in order for you to classify a target population or a subpopulation, you must meet the following. Your project must intend to serve that specific population, and at least 3/4 or 75% of the clients served by the project fit that target description. Now, examples of a target population would be, a single female 18 years old and over, or a single female 18 years and over, and a household with children. So those are kind of examples of what we're talking about when we refer to target population. For subpopulation, examples of those would be a domestic violence or people with HIV. So if your program does not, target those specific target populations and subpopulations, you'll see how it's shown on the screen that it'll state NA not applicable. So not every program has to have a target population or a subpopulation. So we wanted to make sure that if you don't, it's okay. We just really want to know those programs that do. The next section is the HIC beds, which is section 4. So again, this information will pre-populate. So you'll see your 2015 HIC funded beds information. You'll also see the bed and unit availability. Now this is only for emergency shelters. All other programs will get an NA that shows up there. It'll also state your overflow beds. And again, this is only for emergency shelters. All other programs will just see an NA not applicable. You'll have to confirm this data, and if corrections are needed, additional questions will show up on your screen. Now, before we go on, I wanted to take a moment to talk about what we mean by funded beds. When I discuss funded beds, I mean your total number of beds. So that would be your universal number that you'll be using throughout the HIC survey. Again, when we talk about beds, we're really talking about that piece of furniture that is designed for sleep. So that could be, a bed with a mattress or a cot. I also like to look at it as an easier way is a bed in which every person that enters your program sleeps in. So if there's a person in that bed, that's the bed that we're counting, and what we want to really know about. Now, for rapid rehousing and SSVF providers, we will be having a specialized recording, as mentioned previously, because I know that those programs don't have a set number of funded beds or, a total number of beds when they're referring to their program. So for you, you'll only be looking at people, persons that have been placed into permanent housing on the night of Tuesday, January 26th. So we'll be looking at kind of how many of those people are already in a unit, in a bed. So when we refer to beds, we're talking about your total number of households in that unit. And we'll go more into detail in that separate webinar, but I just did want to make everyone informed of that. So on your screen, you'll see the example of the question when we talk about funded beds. So in the previous questions, you have all already indicated what your total number of funded beds was. And then we're going to go into a couple of other questions in that section that talk about the occupied and unoccupied on the night of January 26th. One thing that you must keep in mind that at the bottom, we ask for your total. So your total number of occupied beds plus your total number of unoccupied beds must equal your total funded beds. Oh, sorry. So you're going to have to split those totals up into the different household categories. So we have three. We have households without children, which means single individuals. And then we have households with at least one adult and one child, which I think we refer to as families. And then households with only children. Now, households with only children are households that have children under the age of 18. Okay? So you'll go ahead and complete how many of those beds were occupied based on the different household types. And if you had any unoccupied beds, and what we mean by unoccupied was that those were beds that were available on the night of the 26th. So we're going to go ahead and include those numbers into the middle column. And then finally, we have a section for cribs. For a lot of our family projects, unfortunately, HUD does not consider a crib as a bed. But we know that we do see young infants in our programs. So we do want to provide an avenue for you to let us know how many cribs were occupied on that night. So again, just make sure that your totals do add up. That is one of the main areas that we really look for, that your total funded beds, match the sum of the occupied and the unoccupied beds. Okay. Also, I did want to inform you that for each of these sections, you do have to place a 0 for any household or column that does not apply to your program. So I know sometimes if we don't, if it's a singles program, we don't have any cribs, and obviously we don't have any households with children. So we just kind of tend to skip over those. Please make sure that you do enter a 0 or you will get an error message and will not be able to move into the next section. Now, for those projects that are participating in the point-in-time count sheltered, the point-in-time sheltered count, sorry. So those would be your emergency shelter, transitional housing, interim housing, permanent housing with short-term support, youth projects, and safe havens. Your occupied bed numbers must match your point-in-time tally numbers. So I will also see you when you go to the DFSS trainings, and we'll talk briefly about this, but I do want to know, I do want to inform everyone that those numbers must match. What has happened in the past is that we'll get our HIC numbers stating that you have 50 occupied beds, but when we get the point-in-time count information from DFSS, your program only shows 10 people. So, we want to make sure that that information matches, because, where did those other individuals go? Were they not counted on the point in time? Sometimes we do have, we're all entering this information, so it could be human error. So we just want to make sure that we have all our data correct. So please, if you're not the person, I know sometimes larger agencies have separate people completing the HIC and other people are completing the PIT. Please make sure that you talk to one another to make sure what your numbers are, so that it can be in alignment. That is one of the main areas that I do contact people in the follow-up. And since it tends to happen, maybe mid-February toward the end of February, depending on how many I have to contact, a lot has happened in a month that, you may not remember the total number that you entered into the point-in-time tally sheets. So I do want to encourage everyone to talk to one another, so that way, we don't have to kind of go through our forms and try to remember things of that nature. For all the other programs, this number has to match your total number of beds occupied. So just make sure in the previous question that whatever your total number is there, that's going to match your total number of people in this project. Now, one area that we tend to run into is that depending, how the weather is, sometimes our programs are not at full capacity on the night of. So you could have some beds that were available on the night of the count. And we want to know, since we have such a different array of programs, we want to know if those unoccupied beds could have been used to house, different household types, or maybe, just a certain household type. So what we talk about there is that, and this is more for family projects or projects that see families and singles, or maybe all three of these categories. So since that bed was available and you don't know, it could have housed a single, it could have housed a family, or a child under the age of 18, you kind of can't determine who would have came through your door on that night. So what we ask that you do is that you just enter whichever of the categories you fit. So for those programs that only serve a certain type of household type, so maybe your program is only for singles, you'll just go ahead and select no. I had unoccupied beds that could have been occupied only by a certain household type. So you'll be able to that'll take you to a different question. However, if you had unoccupied beds that could have been occupied by different household types, we want you to include that total number of available beds along with the different types of households that could have been occupied. So, I know for family projects, this tends to be a little bit more difficult because you have a wide variety of family sizes. I would just estimate, what you've seen your average family size. So if you've been seeing that the average family size has been a family of 3, and you had 2 units available, then I would go ahead and assume that it would be 6 beds that were available. Okay? So again, these questions are only related if your program was not at full capacity on the night of the count. And those will show up similar to the screen that I just showed you. The next section is section 5, which we define as new and under development beds. So new beds are any new beds that came on from last year in February to now. And then under development beds are any future beds that are going to come online between February 1st to January 31st of 2017. So for new beds, maybe you had an additional funding source last year, but at the time of the HIC, those beds were not available, but they came online maybe in the summer. So let's say you had 10 new beds that came on in June. So obviously your funded number has increased, but those 10 will be reflected in this section. So I want to know that, because you indicated your total funded bed went from 50 to 60, this will be an area that you'll be able to state that those 10 new beds were because of new funding sources. Under development beds, as we mentioned, are future beds. So let's say that your agency received an award letter that you'll be getting an additional 50 beds. This could be, through the city, through HUD, maybe through private grants and so forth. However, at the time of the HIC, those beds are not available because you're either still waiting for the grant money to come through, or you're just waiting on some other things to kind of be finalized. But you do expect for those beds to be available before January 31st of 2017. So we want to be able to count those beds on the HIC, and you'll be able to indicate that number. Section 6 is related to your HMIS participation. So there are 4 levels of participation for HMIS. You can have all beds that are participating in HMIS. You can have some beds. For our domestic violence projects, you do not participate in HMIS, so you would go ahead and select that option. Or your project would not, just has chosen not to participate in HMIS. So this information will pre-populate from the 2015 HIC, so you will be asked to confirm this data. And if that data has changed, you will have to make some corrections. I just want to take a moment to also talk about new things that are coming through HMIS. So as we've talked about, we've been talking about our funded beds, and as we move through the sections, we'll also be talking about our funded units. This information gets entered into HMIS. We create a bed and unit inventory. So what the HMIS team does is that they're going to be comparing this to the bed lists that are created in HMIS. And in 2016, that information is going to be utilized into the data quality assessments. So we want to be able to make sure that we do have the correct number of beds and units for your projects, because you may run into some issues once the data quality assessments come into those 4 quarters. So we have been noticing kind of a discrepancy in the number of beds and units that are reported into the HIC, and then what's entered into HMIS. So we are really moving forward into aligning items up. And that also takes into account for our COC funded projects. You know, if you have any questions about what your number of funded beds are, you know, I do encourage you to review your project application that was submitted, so that we can make sure that we do have all the correct information across the board. Section 7 is specialized beds. Now, what I mean by specialized beds is I'm really talking about dedicated beds. So we have 3 types of dedicated beds that can be seen in our system. Now, we have chronic homeless dedicated beds, which are we're only counting those for permanent supportive housing. So even if you are an interim housing provider that has a dedicated bed for chronic homeless, that's great. However, for the purpose of the HIC, we won't be counting those. So we will only be taking a look at permanent supportive housing. Another special dedicated bed would be a veteran bed and a youth bed. Now, when we talk about dedicated beds, we mean that, for example, a veteran. When I talk about a veteran dedicated bed, we mean that that bed must be filled by a veteran person and or family who qualifies for the project, unless there are no other veterans located within the city of Chicago. So this means that you are looking at the documentation that would qualify the person as a veteran. So if, let's say that you're not doing that at your project, but you happen to notice that the majority are veterans, that's great. We love that you're housing veterans, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these beds are dedicated for a veteran, okay? We do have programs that have dedicated beds, and we want to make sure that we're counting them accordingly. For youth dedicated beds, you'll have an additional question that talks about the youth age range. So just make sure to review that to make sure that that is in alignment with what the youth age range is for those youth dedicated beds. So new this year, in previous years, we've always asked what your number of dedicated chronic homeless beds, veteran beds, and youth beds are, and you've been able to give us a number. This year, we're going to dive a little bit further and just ask you to indicate, you know, the number of beds that would fit into the different household types. So, you know, we have households without any children, households with at least an adult and a child, households with only children, and then your total. So if you had 10 chronic homeless beds, but they're all for single, you know, you're going to go ahead and include a 10 right there. And then you'll indicate 0 for each of the other sections, and your total should be 10. Okay? So I just want to make sure that as you're completing this chart, you do make sure that everything is adding up. So Section 8 is dedicated to the HIC units. So similar to other sections, you know, this question, oh, sorry about that. These questions are pre-populated from the 2015. So I know I get a couple of questions regarding this from some agencies that do not have a set number of units. So, you know, these are programs that don't really look at what your units are. So you may have a little bit of difficulty answering this question. So when we talk about units, we mean that a unit that is intended for separate living quarters. Now this could be a single room or it could be an entire apartment. It really depends on how your program is. For programs that do not have a fixed number of units, such as congregate shelters, please report the total number of rooms used for overnight accommodations. So I've heard throughout the years that some congregate shelters have a room just for women and another room just for men. So in those situations, even though they don't report data on units, those would be considered as two separate units. Okay, so just keep that in mind as you're completing the HIC unit section. And of course, if you have any questions or just maybe want to talk a little bit further, you know, maybe you see that in 2015 it was 22, but you only count 10 rooms, you know, please feel free to call me. We can definitely have a conversation about this. Okay. Similar to the HIC beds, you're also going to be asked about your occupied and unoccupied units. You're going to have to split those up into the household types, so households without children, households with at least one adult and one child, and households with only children. Again, make sure that those numbers are adding up. That's very important as we move forward. Similar to the HIC beds, we're going to be asking if your program was at full capacity on the night of the count. If you were not at full capacity, you'll be asked additional questions, and it is very similar to the HIC bed questions that were asked. For transitional housing projects only, you'll see this additional question pop up. And it's asking you to describe your unit type, whether it's a single site or a multiple site. And we've included the definition in the question to help you answer accordingly. So a single site would be that your beds and units are located on a single site. So this could either be a congregate or project base, but you are located at one site. Multiple sites are beds and units that are located in multiple sites. So this could be in a scattered site or in sites that are clustered together. Maybe you have multiple buildings on the same block. So we want to know what type of unit type your transitional housing project is. I want to take a moment to talk about kind of the difference between a bed and a unit. So I've been mentioning, and I've really been emphasizing the difference between a bed and a unit. And that's because, you know, we did have a lot of questions last year, so we want to hope this year we don't have that many. So as you can see on your screen, we have defined what a bed and a unit is. And I like to think of a bed as any bed or a cot that a person can sleep in. And we should never see more people in your bed, in your shelter, or in your program more than there are beds. Unless you have small children that are doubled up or cribs, which there are questions in the HIC survey that can help you answer to that, so that way we know that that's happening. Now, a unit is going to be a room or an apartment that is considered as a separate living quarter. And just as before, for those programs like a congregate shelter, you know, that have a room dedicated for only single males or a room dedicated for single females, you know, we're considering those as single as separate living quarters. So we're going to count those as 2 units. Now, we're almost in the home stretch. So we have an optional question. The Employment Task Force has asked us to include a question similar to last year. So this question is completely optional, and you will see this at the end of the survey. This is not a requirement for the HIC, so you can feel free to not answer it if you choose not to. But the Employment Task Force has asked that we include this because they really are looking at data that will inform decisions that they are recommending. And finally, you'll get to the confirmation page. So you'll see a thank you email that will also be sent out, and included in the email you'll receive a PDF of your HIC submission. I encourage you to keep this in your files in the event that I do reach out to you in February regarding any questions. You can feel free to bring that information up so that way you see the information that you provided is the same as that I am looking at. Okay. And I know we have a couple of minutes, so I'm gonna kind of run through these a little bit quickly. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So I've included a couple of slides on common mistakes that I saw in 2015. So I want to ask everyone real quick, kind of what the mistake here is. So this is the section on occupied beds and unoccupied. So as you can see, someone indicated that their funded beds were 50. So the person who completed this went ahead and completed that there were 20 occupied beds for singles, 2 unoccupied beds for singles, and then everything else was not applicable to them. So they went ahead and indicated 0. So you have a total of 20 plus 2, which equals 22. So as you can see, these numbers, this 22 does not equal 50. So please make sure that this total sum adds up to your funded bed. Okay, so that's what's wrong with this entry. The next one is regarding your dedicated beds. So they indicated that their dedicated beds was 50 for chronic homeless. So they went ahead and included that 10 were for single, 10 were for a household with 1 adult and 1 child, and 10 were for only children, which add up to 30. So as you can see, the mistake right there is that this total number does not match the total number of dedicated beds that they indicated in the previous question. So just make sure that as you're going through that those numbers match. Next one, we have a unit example. So here you have that your funded units is 22. And on the night of the count, they had 20 units that were occupied and 2 that were unoccupied. And they brought down the totals to 20 and 2, which add up to 22. However, since they left these blank and did not indicate a 0, they're going to get an error message. So just make sure for each column that is not applicable to your program that you go ahead and indicate 0. Here we have one of my favorites, I have to admit, is that this entry indicated there was 22 funded units. However, as you can see, when they completed the occupied units and the unoccupied units, everything listed 0. So obviously we have a contradiction there. So just make sure that as you indicate what your funded unit numbers are, that they are correctly displayed in the occupied and unoccupied question. So let's talk about the due date again. So again, you have to submit a HIC survey for each question that is applicable, for each program that is applicable to your agency. So it can range from 2, 1, or 10. So it really depends on the applicable projects available at your agency. We will not be accepting PDFs. I did send out the PDF so that you are able to review the survey ahead of time and be able to gather the information. However, all HIC surveys must be submitted via SurveyGizmo. Each HIC survey must be submitted no later than 5 p.m. on Tuesday, January 26th. So please make sure that you go ahead and enter that information by Thursday. A couple of helpful hints. We do encourage you to review the HIC PDF version to review all the questions. And we also ask that you have that information available prior to entering it into SurveyGizmo. This will help you breeze through it, and also, just to help you make any reviews prior to submission. We also encourage you to check in with staff that participated in the point in time to make sure that your questions and data submitted to DFSS and All Chicago are in an alignment. And of course, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to reach out to us. Emails tend to work best just because there are multiple team members, so everyone is able to kind of divide questions if we do have a high number of questions. So we want to be able to get to you in a timely fashion. Some upcoming trainings that I do want to put on everyone's radar is that the SSVF and Rapid Rehousing HIC pre-recorded webinar will be available soon. I will send out an email to those providers just letting you know where the link is once that is available. I know that you'll have a little bit more questions than what we talked about today, so I want to be able to provide a resource for you. HMIS has also created a bed list training that is now available for all the projects that are participating in the point-in-time sheltered count. So maybe you've received an email from the HMIS team regarding this training. I believe that went out yesterday. So feel free to review that training. If you did not receive that and would like further information, feel free to contact either myself or the HMIS team. And finally, the point-in-time in-person trainings will begin on January 18th. If you are participating in the point-in-time shelter count, please register for the training with DFSS. If you have any questions about whether you have to participate in this training, feel free to reach out to me, and I can let you know whether you would have to participate in those trainings. Okay. I know we're a little bit over, so I know Amanda's been answering the questions through the chat box, so any questions that may be helpful?
Most of the questions that we've received are pretty individual, and there are a couple that Elizabeth will follow up with afterwards. They're sort of project specific, but there was just one that came in regarding Shelter Plus Care projects. So will these be submitted by the projects individually, or is DFSS submitting Shelter Plus Care HIC surveys?
Great question. So we are asking that the projects individually have to submit this. As you know, DFSS is, they are a small team, so we do ask that they really focus their attention on the point-in-time count. So if you can help complete the HIC survey for your Shelter Plus Care project, that would be very helpful. And also, I know as the project who oversees that program, you would have that information readily available as to how many individuals were occupied on that night of the count, whether you were at full capacity, whether you were not. So please feel free to include that HIC survey for your agency. Any other questions?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. Thanks, Amanda. Okay, and just those due dates again, Thursday, 5 o'clock, January 28th, okay? all the resources, this HIC webinar, the HIC FAQs, HIC definitions, and the Rapid Rehousing and SSVF webinar will all be posted to our All Chicago website. Once you kind of go to the All Chicago website, we'll be listed under programs, under Chicago Alliance, and just select Continuum of Care. And there will be a section for the housing inventory count regarding all these resources. And I will send out an email with links to that for easier access. So I've listed some key persons to contact regarding questions. If you have any HIC questions, please feel free to contact me, Elizabeth, at cocprograms@allchicago.org, and I have provided my phone number. But again, I would highly encourage for you to send out an email. For any HMIS related questions, feel free to ask the HMIS team at hmis@allchicago.org. Any PIC questions, feel free to reach out to Felicia at DFSS, and her email is seen on your screen. So thank you all for joining us today. Again, I cannot encourage you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I do see Amanda typing away at that question chat box, so I'll be sure to include all those questions into the FAQs for everyone's review. Okay, so that should be posted sometime next week, and I will be sending out an email regarding that information as well. So thank you, and have a great day.